Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here again. The first slide is actually a postcard from South Africa, which I was very fortunate to be able to visit about a year and a half ago, the new South Africa. It is a fascinating country. When you arrive in Johannesburg, as I did, you see a very modern skyline. In fact, it's very undifferentiable from any American city or Canadian city. The roads are big superhighways and the motor cars are modern. Even the people on the streets and driving the cars, for the most part, are indistinguishable from North America. On the other hand, South Africa is a country of contrasts, and there's a great deal of traditional society as well. Now, the reason I was in South Africa is because of this particular chart, which summarizes IQ scores that Professor Richard Lynn alluded to in his talk, based on his review, which was published in 1991. East Asians, both here in the United States and Canada, as well as in their home continents, that's Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans, average a slightly higher IQ than do white people. The average I have there is 106. Sometimes you see the average is a little bit lower, around 103. Whites average about 100. A few estimates may place it a little bit higher and say 103. Black Americans average about 85. And again, blacks in Canada or Britain or in the Caribbean average around 85 too, maybe slightly higher, up as high as 90. But it's the very far bar on that graph which has excited a lot of controversy, the IQ of 70. Because an IQ of 70 is the lowest IQ ever found in the world, and it's based on 20 or 30 different studies from East, South, West, and Central Africa. And it really doesn't seem to change, even if you select the population to be studied from people in primary school, people who've got jobs, people in urban centers. In other words, samples that might be thought to have a slightly higher IQ. The average of 70 to maybe 75 consistently comes out. When the bell curve was published in 1994, this really elevated Richard Lynn's review to international appraisal. And a lot of people in the United States were outraged and very, very critical. In fact, they trashed the bell curve in my own book, partly because we discussed as a serious piece of data the average IQ of 70. Indeed, some members of the academic community who were in favor of the bell curve decided that this was an embarrassment to their perspective. They actually argued something like, look, perhaps within the academic and intelligentsia circles of America, with the bell curve behind us, we just might be able to convince people that IQ is a predictive variable, that it's partly heritable, that there is a black-white difference for whatever reason. But how on earth are we ever going to make headway when there are these extremists like Richard Lynn and Phil Rushton, and depending on which side they got out of the bed that morning, Charles Murray and Arthur Jensen, who actually take this seriously, that the Africans have an IQ as low as 70 to 75. I should put it into context. If white people in Canada or the United States have an IQ of 70, this is considered borderline mentally retarded. So to label an entire continent as having an average IQ of 70, in which case 50% of the African population fall below an IQ of 70, 50% of the African continent by white standards is mentally retarded, is the sort of preposterous sounding rhetoric that academics have to face. So what's the cause of that IQ of 70? Can it be real, or is it somehow false? So I went to South Africa essentially in search of a high IQ African population. I decided I really needed, for my own sake, to at least satisfy myself as to what the true, what the true African IQ score was. Had Richard Lynn underestimated the African IQ? So I searched for a top university within Johannesburg. Some of my colleagues were arguing and saying, look, we know there are many top African students at Harvard and Berkeley and Stanford or Oxford and Cambridge in England, or even at top-notch universities in South Africa. Boy, if you could only test their IQs, you'd find that they were just as bright or almost as bright as the genius level physicists in North America. So I went to South Africa to look for a high IQ group. I teamed up with a group of people who shall still remain anonymous until the article is actually published in about 3 months' time. We had Africans and Cape Coloreds as well as our assistants. For those who actually do these tests and so on, it's sometimes considered that test takers need to be tested by members of their own race and so on. We can have the next one. I went to South Africa myself rather than let my collaborators collect the data because I was very concerned that perhaps all the other IQ tests that had been given under very poor conditions. And I wanted to absolutely standardize the conditions and satisfy for myself, as well as I possibly could, the integrity of the testing. What we did, we had 300 first-year undergraduate psychology students, half of whom were black and half of whom were white, and we paid them $10 US for taking part. We had a huge exam hall, and so they couldn't possibly read each other's answers. It was proctored and monitored by 5 of our assistants. I myself prowled up and down these rows, looking and making sure that everybody did the test studiously. We gave clear instructions that this was a very, very simple test, which I'm going to describe in a minute, but most people finish it within 20 minutes. But we said you could not leave your seat, in fact, for the first 30 minutes. We figured this would ensure that people didn't just slapdash out their answers and collect the $10 and leave. They may as well stay there and do the answers. But in fact, it wasn't even timed. We said you could stay there for an hour and a half and finish the test if you wanted to double check and quadruple check your answers. So it was a stress, it was a perfect testing conditions that I can imagine. We can go to the next one. This is one of the tests. It's a very well-known Raven's progressive matrices. It's non-verbal, so you don't even have to use language to explain it. And what you have to do essentially is to pick from the array of answers at the bottom the piece that is missing from the top. And if you examine the top there, you can see that there's a circle with a couple of lines, which goes into a circle with a full line, and then there's a square with a couple of lines, and you're looking for what does it turn into. And you look around the bottom there, and you'll see that there is, in fact, a square with a full half bottom, and that's the correct answer, which is number 6, I believe. What? It is number 6 is the correct answer. Well, the white university students get 90% of this particular item correct. The African students, 77% of them get it correct. So there's no question that it's a very, very easy item for the vast majority of Africans. They know what is expected of them and they answer the question. It's just that more of them fail this particular item than do the whites. Have the next one. Now this is a much more complicated one, so avert your eyes if you didn't do well on the last one. You now have to choose from an array of 8 at the bottom, and the whole test is much more difficult. But if you examine, if you go down the left-hand column, for example, of answers, you'll see that you've got 3 kinds of symbols there. You've got a diagonal, you've got a vertical line, you've got a vertical and a horizontal, and you've got a horizontal line. And so in each of these columns, you're looking for a horizontal, a vertical, and a cross. And so what's missing in the bottom? And then the other cue you're looking for is the background. You know, do you have a plain background, or do you have lattice work, or do you have crossed lattice work? And so you combine them, and eventually you figure it out. And don't forget, you have a whole minute and a half to do this single item. Anyway, this is another one of the more complicated items, and about 88% of whites pass it, and just under 70% of blacks pass it. We may as well go to the next one. D8. Do you want to put it back on? Sorry, I didn't realize. What is it? Number 1? Oh, it's number 1. Oh, yeah. Oh, D8 is the item number. Number 1 is the correct answer. I'm informed. Okay, these are the results. There were 60 of those items altogether. And they started off very, very easy. The two you saw were medium to high in difficulty. These are the answers. These are the bell-shaped curves that you often see. They're not smoothed, and so they don't look quite like the bell curves. But the African scores peak considerably lower down than do the white scores. In fact, the average Africans get 44 out of 60 correct, whereas the whites got 54 out of 60 correct. Now, 44 out of 60 correct is roughly, according to the norms of the test, what a 14-year-old junior high school student in America gets. And these are first-year university students. Putting it into an IQ context, getting 44 out of 60 correct is an IQ of 84. An IQ of 84 is substantially higher, it's about a standard deviation higher than an IQ of 70, which is the African population. But it implies that since most university students are one standard deviation higher than the average, and the university students have 84, then the average for the South African population as a whole must be about 70. And therefore, this search for a high IQ population supported Richard Lynn's review of all the previous literature showing an IQ of 70. So that seems to hold up.